All right. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to our CAO's seminar today. And it's a pleasure to introduce Timothy Juliano, who hails here from the National Center of Atmospheric Research in Boulder, who told me just that they got a couple of inches of snow. We learn more about that later. Um, a few words to Tim. I met Tim this summer in an international cloud workshop and cloud and precipitation conference, and was very intrigued about his work on cold air outbreaks, how to deal with the remote sensing or field data and all the modeling efforts. And yeah, it's a huge collaborative effort, as you will see, and I was very intrigued by that. And I thought it would be great having him here as a speaker. There are many common interests, and he also collaborates with colleagues at NASA GIS and Columbia. And so I'm glad he could make it in his busy schedule, remotely only, unfortunately, maybe next time in person. Before he starts his talk, a little bit about his history. So I would say Tim is a classically educated atmospheric scientist, meteorologist. He got his bachelor degrees at the Millersville University in Pennsylvania, and then his master's and PhD at the University of Wyoming. And started in 2019 in NCAR as a postdoctoral fellow, but is now through the ranks. It's a project scientist level 2. I think goes two more levels higher or so, but it's ranking up. He's very productive, involved in many field campaigns with many collaborators. And so we are excited that you're here, and please take it off. The title of Tim's talk is Progressing Our Understanding of Arctic Cold Air Outbreaks, Recent Results from the COMBLE Field Campaign. All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction, Daniel. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So my name's Tim Juliano, and Daniel just mentioned the title of my talk. I just want to acknowledge the funding source, which is a DOE ASR program, as well as all of the collaborators who have played an important role in the research I'll be showing today. The short list is here. Really, there's been many other folks as well who have contributed. Okay, let's get right in. So first, I'll provide an introduction to cold air outbreaks for those who may not be familiar. I'll talk about the COMBLE experiment, or the cold air outbreaks in the marine boundary layer experiment. And then I'll jump into the results, and gonna be going pretty quickly today just because there's a lot to show, and it's some really exciting new work that I wanted to share with you. So I'll get into those details here shortly. And then I'll just wrap up, of course, with a brief summary, and some future directions. Okay, so why are we interested in the Arctic? Why is the Arctic important for the global climate system? I think everyone's probably familiar with it, but just in case not, here I'm showing the temperature trend in the Arctic, and the colored lines compared to the global trend. And I think as folks are familiar with, the temperature trend in the Arctic's really been amplified relative to the rest of the globe. We call this Arctic amplification. And it's about 4 times stronger warming the Arctic than everywhere else. And clouds play a really critical role in this region in the Arctic. They can either have a positive or negative forcing. And really the magnitude of the forcing remains quite uncertain. So it's really critical that we try to drill down on some of these cloud feedbacks and kind of better understand the physics and how they're represented in numerical models. So cold air outbreaks are really important events in the Arctic because they can essentially transfer large amounts of mass and momentum toward the equator from the pole. These schematics just kind of demonstrate the what CAOs, or cold air outbreaks, look like. So on the left here, it's showing the transfer of cold air from land masses or sea ice to over the open ocean. And that's what you see depicted nicely here in the satellite image. So the flow is essentially from north to south here, northwest to southeast. You have your large heat fluxes over the open ocean near the ice edge, right? This is where you have the coldest air advecting over the ocean. Very rapidly deepen your boundary layer. So it kind of goes from neutral or stable over the sea ice to quickly convective over the ocean. And then you can see pretty clearly that you develop clouds almost immediately over the ocean. Sometimes you'll even get cloud development over the pack ice, where it's kind of broken up in the so-called marginal ice zone. But really the idea is that you have this big air mass that's shifting from the colder sea ice over the open ocean. And really you can get these transitions in clouds. You can get all sorts of frontal features and these mesoscale structures that develop over the ocean. So we're really interested in a lot of the research I'll be showing today, the cloud streets and how they transition to cells, and what the kind of the morphological structure are of these convective cells that develop. Just a couple more words, big picture on CAOs. These are, as you can imagine, cold season phenomena. So we're focused on this magenta circled region, where in the cold months is when you have the highest frequency of colder outbreaks. You get large snowfall rates, especially toward the north, toward the ice edge, where your heat fluxes are the strongest. You have cloud deepening as you increase your fetch from north to south. And yeah, really winter and spring months favor CAO conditions. Yeah, this is a kind of a critical time in the Arctic too, once you start to get into these regions between the shoulder regions, essentially. So one thing I want to mention about mixed phase clouds, because polar outbreak clouds are inherently mixed phase. In general, mixed phase clouds are quite ubiquitous. Of course, Arctic clouds is one of the most common areas where you can find them. And they're really important for our understanding of precipitation and the radiation balance. So this is just a very high level depiction of mixed phase clouds. And kind of at its core, mixed phase clouds are consistent of supercooled liquid droplets, right? And so this is really telling for how we're going to generate ice formation and grow our ice, how much liquid is essentially supercooled liquid is available in the cloud. How it's spatially distributed is important as well. And won't go into those details, but really just a nice schematic here showing kind of this more genuine mixed phase cloud, where you have kind of an even distribution of liquid and ice, versus this more conditional mixed phase cloud, where you have pockets of regions of liquid and ice. Okay, how do models simulate clouds? Well, it really depends on the scale. And so maybe for those who aren't as familiar with models, this will help kind of depict how we're handling clouds in these different modeling systems. So in a global or regional model, you have a relatively coarse mesh, and you have to parameterize. Of course, parameterize your microphysics. That's much smaller scale, but your clouds are also parameterized, right? Because you can't resolve your clouds at, say, 10 to 100 kilometers or something like that. And then if we break down into smaller scales, where a large eddy simulation is used to, say, represent one of these pixels in a global or regional model, now we've resolved the clouds. We can hopefully at least resolve the largest scales of the turbulence. We can get the clouds pretty well. Of course, you're still parameterizing the microphysics. We won't talk about DNS, but that's kind of the next scale down, where you're actually able to resolve everything. So in this talk, we're just going to talk about mostly regional models, high resolution regional models, and also large eddy simulations. And then one kind of example of a CAO from the North Atlantic Ocean. I thought this was a nice example, a nice schematic showing the interplay between liquid and ice. So what they found was essentially, as the air mass advected over, as the cold air advected over the warmer ocean, there's kind of this mostly overcast cloud deck initially that's dominated by liquid. And then there's kind of this rapid ice generation thereafter. Precipitation processes really get going, and then you get a cloud breakup. And that's kind of, again, just the schematic showing this evolution. The caveat here, I will say, is being generally in this region in the North Atlantic, the M values, or the stability, it's not as unstable, I should say, and it's likely a bit more polluted than Arctic clouds, but this kind of holds true. And then I just want to say, different mesoscale and high resolution regional models will produce dramatically different CAO clouds, even at the same resolution. So this first column is showing 1 kilometer simulation with the cumulus parameterization off from 3 different models. And you can just see drastically how different the mesoscale structure is. So this is just something to keep in mind as I go through the results. I'm using one model. It doesn't mean that this is how things will be in every model, but we can still really understand the physics as we probe into some of these sensitivity studies I'll show. Okay, about the COMBLE experiment. Let's check the time. Good. So the colder outbreaks in the marine boundary layer experiment took place from late 2019 to early 2020. The DOE AMF1 site was deployed there with aerosol measurements, as well as an instrument suite further to the northeast on Bear Island. So this is a zoom-in view of the COMBLE site. This is Andoya, really Bear Island on the northern edge of the Scandinavian coastline. And you'll see some more zoomed out pictures so you can see the perspective a bit better. So again, here's the AMF1 Andenes site. This is the site we'll really be focusing on for the majority of this talk. But there were also measurements taken at the Bear Island site. So this image is from March 28th, 2020. This is an intense colder outbreak where we had roll convection that transitioned to cells far downstream. And you can see by the time we get to Andenes at this fixed site, the cells can be quite large in this case, at least. This is just an overview of the measurements that were taken at the AMF1 sites. We had a couple of radars, a scanning radar, vertically pointing Kaiser radar, which I'll be showing quite a bit, aerosol observing system, radar wind profiling system, and just kind of some other measurements related to microwave radiometry and micropulse LiDAR. Okay, so this is a summary of the conditions during the COMBLE field campaign. So the M values, as I say, it's just the difference between the sea surface temperature, theta at sea surface, and theta at 850 millibars. So really, the more positive that is, that means the stronger the gradient is, and the more unstable it is, the stronger heat fluxes you would expect. So that's why in this color fill, where we have M values approaching 10 in the green colors, we have in the black lines the contoured heat fluxes. We see a good correspondence, as you might expect, because the temperature gradient really drives the surface heat fluxes. At the Andenes site, the winds were mostly from the northwest during the CAO conditions, which is expected. We'd expect this kind of onshore flow from the open ocean. Right? Okay, during COMBLE, we had CAO conditions about 19 and warm air intrusion, WAI. I won't talk about that, but that's kind of the counterpart to CAOs, right? That's poleward air mass transitions rather than equatorward. They occurred about 17% of the time, so almost equal. And really, this tells us that they represent the tail ends of the synoptic variability, and they kind of, it's this yin and yang, right? They balance each other out. But point being, all the blue periods are CAO periods. We had a nice distribution of events during COMBLE, which is great. And then I wanted to show just kind of examples of open cells and during strong cases, and more closed cells during weaker cases. So this is vertically pointing radar results. In this very top panel, it's reflectivity. The next panel is the modeled reflectivity. The next one down is the observed Doppler velocity. So this is vertically pointing. And then the modeled Doppler velocity, and this is run through Ford simulator. And really, you can see, these really large cells in the OBS, really intense vertical motions, a lot of turbulence, and with that comes a lot of liquid water path production. The model, of course, doesn't capture the structures as well as the observations. We wouldn't expect it. This is a mesoscale model. I won't go into those details, but just something to keep in mind that really you want to go down to finer scales. But this is an example of open cells during an intense case, and then closed cells down here at the bottom of a weaker CAO case. It's a more stratiform deck, more homogeneous conditions. And so this will kind of set the stage for some of the results I'll show in a little bit. The March 13th case from COMBLE is one that we'll be focusing on quite a bit. It was an intense CAO case. It was the most intense one. It was a long fetch, right? So we had about 1,000-kilometer fetch from rolls to cells that were observed at the AMF site. And the cells in this case, because it was so intense and there was a long period of time for the boundary layer to grow, and by the time it gets to the site, it wouldn't even really call it a boundary layer, but the clouds get to about 3 to 5 kilometers, and they exhibit a pretty clear life cycle that I'll talk about in more detail. But just to kind of whet your appetite a bit, this is just a kind of a nice contrast. So this is, again, is a time height plot at the AMF1 site. And you can see right next to each other 2 different cells that are in very different phases. So for example, this red one is likely in a more mature dissipating stage. The vertical motions are relatively weak. Spectral width here is very small. And there's essentially little to no liquid production. And the cell directly next to it, developing stage, you have very strong vertical motions, you have large spectral width values, and you have a lot of liquid production. So this just really contrasts kind of this open cell life cycle. And yeah, I'll talk about this in more detail. Okay, so cell identification. So just a real quick refresher on these CAO cloud transitions. The air mass starts over the sea ice, very cold air near the surface. Your flow is in this direction. You have convection of cold air over warm water. You have strong fluxes, surface fluxes. You have a lot of wind shear in this area. I didn't really talk about wind shear, but it's very baroclinic. You have a lot of vertical wind shear, and so you develop these cloud streets. As you move downward, downwind, I should say, your surface flux is decreased, the boundary layer is warmed, it's deepened, your vertical shear is decreasing. You have this transition at some point. There's all sorts of processes at play. I'm not going to go too much into those details right now, but you have this transition towards cellular convection, and that's really what we're going to focus on, because really the AMF site is essentially down here, right? So we're only capturing this cellular period. Again, an open cell convection example on the top. It's kind of what I just showed you in a couple of slides back. And then a closed cell example here on the bottom, which again, it's just this contrast in the cloud structures. The cloud tops are pretty homogeneous. You have relatively weak vertical motions, but this is just to show you kind of what we're dealing with. So what we do is we look at the CASER, vertical radar, and satellite imagery to determine periods where we had cells. We only look at periods or only look at clouds during the CAO periods. And if we have polar lows or disorganized clouds or upper level clouds kind of disrupting this, we don't consider them. So we're just looking at more pristine periods. So what we come up with is a total of 17 periods. The data are skewed toward open cells, certainly more than closed cells, which kind of makes sense, right? If the clouds are getting all the way down that far, that's a long fetch, and it's likely that they're going to be open cells. So CAOs, yeah, are more intense during the open cellular periods, and in general, during open cellular periods, the cloud top heights are more variable and deeper. So this is kind of an expected results, but it's just something to keep in mind that our data are skewed toward open cells. Okay, so this is really work that Christian Lackner, who was at University of Wyoming and now is at Brookhaven. Christian led this. This is mostly his work. He did a great job. So I'm just kind of summarizing this, but I have the QR code if you want to look at the gory details of the methodology and the results. But the idea is that Christian used this watershed segmentation method to identify individual cells from the inverted CASER reflectivity field. And so this is just an example of what that looks like. So in that time height transect of the reflectivity, here's the kind of the shift or the identification of these individual cells shown by these different colors. Okay, so we needed some quantitative way. You can quibble about what thresholds you use, how to get the cells exactly the way you want them, but ultimately you have to make some decisions and have some way to quantify this. And then what he did was, for each of those cells, he extracted the CFAD, or the contoured frequency by altitude diagram of reflectivity, Doppler velocity, and spectral width. And then he plugged those into a self-organizing map, where essentially you give your three CFADs to the algorithm. So 3 of them combined counts as one input vector, essentially, and you have your many dozens of cells. And then so the SOM does its best, the self-organizing map does its best to try to put these into regimes and classify them into their more kind of unique structures based on the input vector. And again, this is the QR code if you're interested in looking at this in more detail. So I'm just going to do some snapshot results here. And this is the outputs from the SOM, essentially, of the cell classifications. So one thing about the SOM is you have to tell it how many different regimes or nodes you kind of want it to organize the results into. Christian played around with a number of different ones, came up with this 3x3 node map, which seemed pretty reasonable, gave us a good distribution of samples. And really you have, and these, I should say, these classifications, these names, come out of much analysis that's done in the paper that I won't go into the details of, but basically there's these different stages of the cellular convection that we believe is observed by the radar. And so we have these more intense life cycles, so developing, mature, and weakening. We have these more moderately, not as intense life cycles. We have more stratiform type of clouds, and then we have these anvil type of clouds, which kind of come about from more dissipating cells and dissipating systems. So I'm just going to focus on this kind of life cycle transition from developing to mature to weakening, just for the sake of time. So if we look at the cloud macrophysical characteristics for these, so again, just developing, mature, and intense. So intense cells grow in size with their development. Here I'm showing the cell width. So this is the mean in the dark line, and then the shading is the standard deviation. So the developing cells are the smallest, as we might expect, and as they get larger and larger, they get wider. During the weakening stage, they tend to be widest near the cloud top, and this may be due to kind of more spreading out near the cloud top once they get quite large and hit the inversion. In the developing stage, the cloud tops are lower and warmer than at the mature stage, and that kind of makes sense, right? You know, your plumes are kind of initializing, and they're not quite large yet, and they get larger and larger, and at some point, they get as tall as they can be. And so we have here the distributions of cloud top temperature in blue for each of these, cloud base height and cloud top height. And what's interesting is in this weakening phase, this more kind of mature, is really your cloud top temperature distribution shifts enough so that in this very cold environment, you do reach homogeneous freezing levels. So this seems to be not uncommon in at least this regime, which is something to note for sure. Also, there's a substantial amount of supercooled liquid water in these developing cells, which makes sense because their vertical motions are kind of the strongest. You have the most turbulence. You're driving your initial liquid water production. And then as they mature, the cells begin to glaciate. And really, there's not nearly as much liquid in these more mature. And of course, the weakening cells, they're essentially fully glaciated, right? There's very little liquid remaining, mostly in this cloud phase product, mostly showing snow dominating. And this phase transition is also associated with the observed precipitation formation. And the life cycle of the cells is associated with cold pools as well. And so this makes sense because as the cells precipitate out, right, they develop these downdrafts through evaporation, sublimation, and precipitation. And those spread out and create convergence zones, and that's where you create your new developing cells, and the life cycle continues. So that's kind of the picture that we think emerges from this. Christian went a step further and looked at whether these regimes were due to sampling bias. So one could say, okay, well, it's a vertically pointing radar. You could just be missing a bunch of cells and seeing the edges, for example, and maybe the SOM method is just kind of clustering them into regimes based on where you're sampling the cells. So the goal is to determine whether these nodes are correlated with transects through specific parts of the cells. And we, or Christian, I should say, essentially linked the vertical Kaiser with the horizontally scanning C-band radar and determined or computed the minimum relative distance from the cell center. So that's shown in red. You could probably ignore the blue. That's just the cell size for each node. But that's shown in red. So essentially, values that are smaller would equate to hitting the cores more so, and values that are larger would equate to hitting the edges of the cells more so. So in general, the nodes have a pretty good range of where the cells are sampled. Some of them are more in the core region, and some of them are more in the edge region, and some kind of a mixed bag. But in general, none of them are really biased heavily. So we feel pretty confident that the methodology is pretty robust, and it's not really biased by the sampling method here. Okay, so that's the first one. I'm going to keep going. If there's like any clarifying questions, please stop me if something isn't like not clear. But I think I'll just keep going and just wait for questions. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk about some more preliminary work, and this is about mass flux in the CAO environment. So as you might imagine, in this very convective, turbulent environment, you have organization of structures, right? And so we have organization of clouds. We would assume that there's some organization of these boundary layer structures. And so in order to represent this in numerical models, what's often done is there's this kind of combined so-called eddy diffusivity mass flux approach. So the smaller scale turbulence with down gradient diffusions represented by eddy diffusivity. But if you want to represent these more counter gradient large scale motions, I shouldn't say large scale, but larger structure motions in the boundary layer that are coherent, you need to use a different approach just because the down gradient eddy diffusivity approach just isn't adequate. And so what's typically done is this more mass flux approach. And so this schematic is showing that where these kind of little arrows are kind of the little eddies that are represented more so with this eddy diffusivity methodology, and then these larger coherent structures need to be represented some other way, right? So for this mass flux approach, you need to make, I'm not going to go into the gory details, but you need to make some decisions about what fraction of your model grid cell is made up of coherent updrafts, and also what is the vertical velocity of these coherent updrafts, right? And so there's a spectrum, right? It's not just one value, there's a spectrum. But in the model, it's not so cut and dry how you pick these values. So typically for EDMF, you have to assume that the fraction of cells, or the fraction of the cell that's composed of these coherent updrafts are much smaller than 1, so something on the order of 1/10. And then what threshold do you select to determine this value? So this value comes back from decades ago. You know, this is a long-standing problem, but really, you know, how good is this assumption? So if we look at some COMBLE results, and this was a nice paper led by Zachary Magis, looking at COMBLE results, updraft properties at the AMF site for different CAO cases. So the updrafts was found were mostly between 2 and 5 meters per second, so quite strong. And the updrafts are typically less than 1 kilometer wide, okay? So pretty small. Now what they did next was they coarsened that, so that's just like the raw observations, really high temporal resolution. They coarsened that to using a 250 meter filter and a 1,000 meter filter. And what you see is you essentially lose the structure of the updrafts completely, which makes sense based on what they found, right? If you use a 1 kilometer filter, obviously, if everything's smaller than that, you're just going to miss it. So this really motivates the need for LES-informed studies to look at this from a more holistic view and understand what these properties are like. So to further motivate this, we ran some high-resolution mesoscale simulations. This is work that was recently published. You can find the details there. Essentially, we used the weather research and forecasting model, the WRF model, ran at 1 kilometer grid cell spacing, so pretty high resolution, for 2 of the intense CAO cases during COMBLE, the 13th and the 28th. excuse me, we used an aerosol aware scheme, and then we tested 4 different turbulence closure approaches, including this EDMF scheme. So what we find is that EDMF compares best to satellite cloud top temperature, as opposed to some of these other approaches for a turbulence closure. But when we compare to the AMF1 measurements, so from ground-based, it actually performed, I wouldn't say performed badly, but it performed worse. And in this analysis, we found that the EDMF clouds are too deep and they're too cold. So that tells us that likely the mass flux scheme is too active. It's overactive. So for this mass flux approach, again, this is, I'll just break this down, try to do it fairly quickly, but this term on the left here is essentially the parameterized vertical heat flux that the model is trying to represent, right? This is due to turbulence. This first term is this eddy diffusivity approach, which is kind of typical. And then the right most term is this more non-local counter gradient term due to the mass flux. And again, the mass flux, which is M here, is composed of this updraft fraction. And so we have that plotted here from the model outputs. So A, this is from the EDMF scheme. It's a mesoscale model, right? We're not resolving turbulence. This is A, and you can see that the values for the updraft fraction are, first off, the largest value is 10%. So this particular scheme has a threshold. You can't go more than 10% of the grid cell fraction. So the area coherent updraft is limited to 10%. The fraction decreases with altitude, so it's largest near the surface. And then for the mass flux, we actually get the largest magnitudes kind of toward the middle to the upper part of the cloud layer. So we want to understand how reasonable these assumptions and results are from this scheme. So we turn to our LES. So we ran this kind of benchmark hero LES simulation. So this animation is showing, hopefully it's coming through, it's showing pseudo albedo from the LES. The whole domain here is resolved at 150 meter grid cell spacing. So it's a very, very, very large and computationally expensive simulation, as you might imagine. I'm happy to talk more about the details. I won't do it right now, but what I just want to say is the general approach is that, and my cursor is very laggy because this is a big animation. And each of those blue boxes are essentially a backward trajectory starting at the AMF1 site at the bottom here. We run a backward trajectory and we want to know the location of where the air parcel is along that trajectory. And so we can just extract that from our model, right? We have full 3D fields, which is great. So our goal here is to understand the updraft area and mass flux properties. And we want to look at this whole transition, not just in the cellular region. We want to look at the whole transition. And it's pretty simple. We just essentially take the center point of the backward trajectory location and we extract the updraft fraction and the mass flux for different vertical velocity thresholds in a 25 by 25 kilometer box. So this is just to kind of mimic a typical maybe ESM or coarse numerical weather prediction model grid box. And you could do all different sizes. You can play around with that, but I'm just showing one result for now. So this plot is just getting right in the results. This is the updraft fraction by vertical velocity threshold. So again, you have to pick a threshold to determine the updraft fraction, right? You can say, okay, I want to find the fraction of updrafts if I say it's at least 1/10 of a meter per second, or at least 1 meter per second. So that's what we did. We just selected a bunch of different thresholds. And as you might expect, as you increase your threshold, your fraction is going to decrease, right? Because you're just getting to more and more strong force. So the solid line here is just the cloud top height to give you some idea of where the boundary layer roughly is. So the updraft fraction in the boundary layer at these really small thresholds is on the order of about 30 to maybe 35%. And as you go up, of course, it decreases. And updraft fraction is strongly dependent on the threshold that we use. And this really should correspond to what your model grid spacing is, right? If you have a finer model grid spacing, you'll resolve more updrafts, and so you don't need the mass flux parameterization. It's a parameterization. That's one thing I should have hammered home. you don't need the parameterization to account for it because you're resolving. If you're in a really coarse global model and you're not resolving the updrafts, you need the parameterization to do everything for you. So this is something that we need to think about as being grid dependent, and it needs to have some flexibility there. We find also that the maximum values are typically in the middle of the boundary layer, and over time they generally decrease. So these values are largest near the roll area. And the results agree pretty well with some previous work that looked at just the roll cloud region. Now, if we look at the mass flux, it gets a little more interesting. So in this first plot, I'm showing the actual mass flux in the 10th of a meter per second threshold plot. And then in the other plots, I'm showing the relative contribution. So we want to understand what the relative contribution in the mass flux of those particular updrafts is. So if we look at updrafts that are at least a meter per second, they contribute more in the roll regime than in the cell regime. That kind of decreases over time in the lower part of the boundary layer. But what's really interesting is these really strong updrafts become pretty important in the upper part of the cloud layer and downstream. So this tells us that these strong updrafts really kind of punch above their weight, despite their pretty small fractional size. They have really intense updraft cores and they contribute disproportionately to the mass flux. One last thing on this is I was happy to see that we have pretty good correlation between surface heat flux. So remember, as we go through time, the surface heat fluxes are decreasing, right? We have pretty good correlation between surface heat flux and updraft fraction and mass flux. So it's possible that there could be a way to improve on some of the ways that the spectral models represent this right now. This is kind of I should say these lines here. This is the updraft fraction and sensible heat flux. And there's a lot of detail here, I'm sorry, but the different colors are for the different parts of the boundary layer. So the darker colors are near the surface and brighter colors are toward the top. This is very reminiscent of how this is done in MY and EDMF, where updraft fraction on the Y and heat flux on the X, you have this, they use a hyperbolic tangent function to represent this, which some of these lines kind of look like that, others don't. Again, we need to think about, not just using a blanket function for everywhere, right? We have to think about which part of the boundary layer we're in and what the mesh size is. Okay. Don't think I'm doing very good on time. Okay. So I think, yeah, I'll go through this one pretty quickly and probably just do a plug for the last one. I think that's all I'll do. Okay, this is a really exciting project. This next one, instrument model synergy to develop a liquid water path retrieval. This is work that's been led by Sam Frame at University of Miami. And this is kind of hot off the press as a preprint if you're interested in looking at this. But the goal of this is to develop a accurate real-time water vapor path and liquid water path retrieval for the CAESAR campaign, which was a recent cold air outbreak NSF campaign that occurred earlier this year. Challenges when using, we use the GVR, G-band vapor radiometer. And so challenges with using this to retrieve these types of things, the optimal estimation techniques, as well as large particles like snow that complicate the retrieval. Okay, so the solution is to use this GVR instrument as well as the Wyoming Cloud Radar, WRF simulations, and a machine learning algorithm. So this is just an image of the GVR. It's upward looking on the NCAR C130. There's 4 sidebands here, so 183 gigahertz water vapor absorption line, plus these other bands. And it's mostly sensitive to water vapor and liquid water, and less so to large hydrometeors. And so, what nicely complements it is the Wyoming Cloud Radar. So there's a 95 gigahertz cloud radar developed by University of Wyoming. We use the upward-looking beam because we want to look at the same region, and obviously it's quite responsive to larger hydrometeors. Okay, I'm gonna fly through some of this, but essentially what we did was Sam used the model outputs that I've run. So I showed you some examples of the model simulations that we've run. He essentially took those model outputs and he ran them through a Ford simulator called PAMTRA, Passive and Active Microwave Radiative Transfer. And so he essentially forward simulated the GVR and the WCR from the model outputs. So really what's nice about this is we're interested in the responses between the cloud fields and the water vapor fields and what the forward simulator says. And we're not so worried about, is the model getting the clouds correct? That's what's nice about this problem, right? So he takes the inputs, which are really the forward simulated outputs, runs it through his machine learning algorithms, and gets a predicted liquid water path, water vapor path. So yeah, PAMTRA uses the outputs to essentially simulate the GVR brightness temperatures and WCR reflectivities. This is just a snapshot example from a small domain near the cellular region, showing liquid water path in A, snow water path in B, and then these brightness temperature here in AI and BI. And you can see for liquid water path, the brightness temperatures are highly sensitive and weakly sensitive to liquid water path and snow water path, respectively. And then here it's just showing the reflectivity. So this is just an example of what the PAMTRA. Testing the model, Sam did some perturbation tests to try to account for instrument error as well as for particle shape uncertainties related to mass size relations, really just to try to cover bases here. And you can see that the tests have come out quite nicely. And this is kind of like the kind of take-home message slide for this. Here we're showing the retrieval. So what Sam did was he developed that relationship, and then he took it out to the field and in real time applied it to the GVR retrievals on the aircraft. So on the aircraft during Caesar, we actually had estimates of it. He refined it afterward, of course. But it was great because, as soon as you're upward looking, right, you're not in cloud, and you can get estimates of liquid water path, which is fantastic. So Sam did some comparisons between this retrieval algorithm and the in situ measurements when we did spiral ascents and descents. And you can see that the agreement is quite good. Little bit of bias, negative bias compared to the CDP and positive compared to King, but overall, the agreement's quite good. So we're very happy with this. And then this is the water vapor path comparison, and that also looks quite good. And this is a nice example of a transition from closed to open cells during Caesar, the quarter outbreak experiment here, where the reflectivity is shown in the top here. This is closed cells. You can see that there's really no gaps between them. And then we transition to this more open cellular regime. And the liquid water path here, this is from his retrieval. This is below cloud-based. The liquid water path, you can see pretty clearly a shift in structures kind of right here when you have this more open cellular regime. And this is pretty similar to what was seen in some other CAO measurements in North Atlantic here. It looks kind of reminiscent to that. So this is just an exciting way where we're able to use model outputs from COMBLE, and we could essentially enhance, refine this instrument algorithm, which is really kind of an exciting avenue that I didn't necessarily expect initially when we ran the simulations. Okay, and then lastly, I have some ongoing results from this model observation intercomparison project. I'm gonna skip on this, to be honest. So yeah, an overview of this COMBLE MIP, as we call it, model observation intercomparison project. We want to look at the March 13th CAO case. So that's the really intense case that I was showing before at COMBLE, where we had the very large cells. They were 3 to 5 kilometers deep. And we want to run LES and SCMs to try to reproduce the evolution of the cloud field under these very strong conditions. So we ran 20 hours simulations, 2 hours upwind of the ice edge. The model forcing essentially came from Era 5. We used initial soundings from Era 5. Because the air mass is traversing in the model, we need a way to represent that in a more simplified way, right? So what we do is we change the skin temperature of the model, because as the model goes from the sea ice to over the open ocean, the SST is the surface forcing is really driving a lot of the evolution, right, of the system. We don't do any kind of we don't do any kind of nudging. We don't do any kind of subsidence imposition. All we do is for the dynamical forcing is we have time varying geostrophic wind profiles. So it's really the large scale pressure gradient force that's imposed through the geostrophic wind in the model. And so the idea is that we're trying to constrain where we're trying to have all of the different modeling groups set up their models in a similar way, where we should get convergence, but we want to let the models express themselves in enough of a way where we get differences, right? We're not trying to constrict everything so much. For the microphysics, we have two kind of sets of configurations. One's fixed droplet, where droplet number is 20 per cc, and diagnostic ice formation, where the minimum total is 25 per liter. These numbers came about from some using observational constraints to kind of play around with that. And really, we're just trying to emulate the immersion mode heterogeneous ice nucleation in this setup. Homogeneous drop freezing is also active. And then for the observational constraints, obviously we had the arm measurements and we had satellite, basically. So yeah, I've got a couple of minutes left, I guess. So this is showing the backward trajectory. So again, the arm site's all the way down here at the bottom, and we want our model to start up here and follow the air mass with the flow and try to represent this shift. This is a schematic. This is a table showing the different participants. Not going to go through them all. Healthy participation. It's really nice to see all the interest we've had. If you're interested in learning more about the myth, because I unfortunately wasn't able to cover too much today, but we do have a website set up. Okay, some of the observational constraints that also show some of our results. On the left here, I'm showing cloud top height on the top, cloud optical depth, liquid water path, ice water path, and cloud top temperature. So these are variables for which we have some observational constraints. The ones at the very end that you see are from the arm site, because we end up at the arm site. Upwind, it's more difficult because we don't have arm measurements. So we have to really rely on satellite quite a bit. We have mostly measurements at the beginning from calliope of cloud top height, ice water path, and cloud top temp. And then what's really nice is we have this MAC liquid water path product that kind of has a constraint for liquid water path across the entire trajectory. So overall, these are all of our LES results. Overall, the models, I think, are doing reasonably well. They kind of fall mostly on top of each other. You get all these wiggles, which are really due to the domain size. The model domain size is pretty small. And so once your cells get large, these are periodic boundary conditions. That's an important point I didn't bring up. You're just cycling your cell through. So we're going to be running larger domains in the future. This bottom plot is showing EMC squared radar lidar simulator, where we forward simulate the model outputs. Maybe to the trained eye, you can tell which panel or which columns are model outputs and which are OBS. But in general, we're pretty happy with our results, and we have a little more to do on this to refine things, but overall quite pleased. And answer is the left side is the OBS. So, and then these are the vertical profiles once we get down to andiness. Again, we're doing pretty good overall without doing too much with respect to nudging and subsidence. Okay, real quick results. Going to zoom through this. We find that surface fluxes dictate cloud deepening. This is really strongly surface forced. The surface fluxes are having a big effect. LES are all in blue here. The SEMs are in different colors. The SEMs don't collapse as well as the LES, and maybe that's not a surprise. Surface fluxes dictate the boundary layer stratification. So when we compute the difference in the water vapor near the surface compared to the upper part of the cloud layer, we can see a pretty clear correlation. And this really just has to do with decoupling, right? Once you get precipitation processes going, they tend to decouple your boundary layer. It's not as well connected to the surface. And then we also find that ice water path increases boundary layer stratification, primarily snow. This is through snowfall. But this is not nearly as clear a relationship. You get a lot more scatter, and the SEMs don't really align too well with the LES. Okay, now this is just radiative results. They're kind of interesting. I'm still wrapping my head around some of this. But this plot is showing on the x-axis cloud top height over max cloud top height. This is just a way to normalize, because all of the models have different cloud top heights. So it's just a way to normalize. And the y-axis is surface downwelling long wave flux over the max value. And this is, again, just to normalize. But you can see that pretty quickly as your clouds deepen, that rapidly increases the long wave flux at the surface. I mean, makes sense, right? You develop cloud, and really through time, your cloud base is probably pretty constant. It's not changing a whole lot, and so that's why you're getting kind of this leveling off. In terms of the TOA upwelling long wave flux, you have really a range in responses to cloud deepening. And so you see some of these models are actually kind of saturating. Other models are actually decreasing over time. So obviously this is going to be affected by where your cloud is in terms of the top, right? And also what the phase partitioning is near cloud top. I don't really understand why we're getting so much of a decreasing down here in some of these models. That's still something, this is a newer plot that I made, so it's something that I'm trying to understand, and would love to hear some thoughts if people have ideas there. Okay, so finally to the summary. I'm probably just going to skip over this because you've already seen it. But if you're interested, I'm happy to send links to the papers. So just last slide on future directions. Obviously, we want to continue to mine this benchmark LES data set that we have. There's a lot there, and there's a lot to at least my interest: coherent boundary layer structures, cloud transitions. And if you have ideas or are interested in collaborating, please let me know. We have prognostic aerosol in the model. I know a lot of people are interested in aerosol cloud interactions. There's prognostic aerosol, which is great. We want to extend, of course, the MIP analysis. There's a lot for us to do there. And then the Caesar campaign is really exciting because we have these awesome aircraft observations. We're hoping that we can do some nice modeling of some of the recent cloud measurements. Yeah, I think I'll leave it with that. So thanks for your attention. This is a picture of the snowfall from Boulder this morning in my backyard. So really, pretty great. Winter is here, I guess. Yeah, so if you have any questions or comments or interested in collaborating, please, would love to hear from you. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Tim, for this really nice and clear seminar. I'm sure there are some questions in the audience. I will check out of the chat, and please raise your hand. I cannot see all of you at once, so you can give a shout out if you have questions. Maybe anyone? Minghua, I see Minghua. Please go ahead. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Tim, for the seminar. That's really nice. Now, in one of your view graphs, you showed the vertical profile of moisture. And it looks like the ERA has a pretty dry bias relative to the sounding. Is that right? Or more moist bias? Yeah.
Is this the plot here?
Yeah. The second one.
Right. Yeah, that's a great eye there. Attention to detail. So, right. So Era 5 is the black line. I didn't really explain this. Era 5 is the black line. ARI, which is the radiometer, is this these purple lines, and then the radiosonde RS are these gray lines. And so, yeah, it seems like Era 5 has this strange decoupled type of profile here. The radiosondes, don't forget, are getting launched just intermittently, right? And so they could go in between a cell, they could fall inside of a cell. And so that's maybe on the upper end here, because some of them we know went inside of a cell. But it seems like Era 5 maybe it's maybe a little dry, but this strange structure down here maybe is a little surprising, and this may have to do with decoupling.
So is this used like the EI5 is used as the initial conditions of the model?
Yes, exactly. Era 5 we used as initial conditions, and then what we did was we actually just let the model go. We didn't nudge it any further. So we just imposed the surface temperature, skin temperature, and other than that, we just let it go. And so honestly, so let me explain. Sorry, the blue and orange are two of the LES from the MIP. We were amazed at how good the models did without any additional forcing, essentially.
Yeah, that's a little bit surprising. Oh, of course, you are doing a Lagrange method, therefore, like it's incorporated the horizontal advection in the simulation. But then
yes, right.
Yeah, then the vertical motion, apparently there isn't probably much larger scale subsidence.
Right, we found subsidence to not really be important in this particular case. Right off the ice edge, when the boundary layer is still shallow and there's still a strong inversion, there is an effect of the subsidence. We did tests, of course. But once you get about halfway through the simulation, the boundary layer just grows so rapidly that it doesn't even matter.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe since we're on the slide, I jump quickly in here because I also looked at this slide and I looked at the cloud top temperature in the left bottom, that plot. And I tried to wrap my head around that there is a cloud forms and the temperature goes up, but then it cools down as we have the cold air outbreak. Is that, I mean, I'm wondering from where comes the cloud warming? I mean, it's still cold, but it goes from -30 to -22 or something, and then it starts decreasing. How do you relate that to which stage of the cloud, or why is the profile looking like that? So naively, I would have thought, well, it is, and then it just continuously rises. I mean, the temperature decreases as the cloud top rises, but it seems it pops and then it gets warm.
Right. That's strange, right? So I think that has to do with the kind of initial shock to the system and the initial spin up time. So that's how I gather it. Because I think what's happening is the boundary layer hasn't really warmed up enough yet. You develop clouds so rapidly because the fluxes are so strong. And then the time scale that it takes to actually start warming up the boundary layer is a bit. And I think that's what the lag is there. That's what I think. But it's a good point. I was kind of trying to understand that myself.
Okay, so it could be I'm not saying artifact, a modeling artifact, but how the model is initialized or spun up, or maybe there is something. I thought naively, is it latent heat or in addition, or what is happening? Because you say it's almost like an explosion, or the heat flux is so high, it really starts forming readily, also in your satellite images. So you will have, well, the latent heat flux is maybe still less than the surface heat flux. I don't know, but anyway, I was thinking around that concept, but maybe. Okay.
That's certainly possible, yeah. We haven't dug into that.
All right. Any more questions? Anyone? No? No, I'm looking.
I realize I presented a lot of information. So.
Yeah, there was a lot going on. Yeah, I mean, I love the picture, the satellite picture, how the rolling clouds over thousands of kilometers go into convective cells. And if you look closely at your satellite images, even the initial thin stream stays and it gets wider. And it's I think on page 13 or something like that, in the beginning, you had this, here you can see it too, but you had another one where it's quite unbelievable that it stays so long. How did you call that? Like this kind of canyon streets in the beginning of your introduction. That really defines it, where it all happens. It just becomes wider and wider. It's quite striking.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm getting to it. I know which image you're talking about. Probably this one here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this one. Yeah, exactly. If you zoom in, I mean, this kind of street or stays in principle till Norway. Which is quite flabbergasting. It's amazing. It starts from the ice edge, very narrow, small, and then it becomes, as you say, I mean, the cells are 14 kilometers or wider, but it still stays confined in this kind of line.
Yeah,
which is amazing.
It is pretty fascinating. Yeah, and the models. I mean, if you run a realistic case like we did, the model doesn't obviously get that.
Yeah. That's the key, right? It's really a shame if we could do that, and that's maybe my last comment, then we finish up. But as you always emphasize, you're measuring at the end or in Andenes, where you have the large convective cells. It would be nice to have the same measurement, stationary every 500 kilometers or so. We still don't understand or what really happens from the ice sheet to, I mean, it's tricky. It would be ship-based, having a ship there stationary would be a great advantage with the radars, maybe somewhere in the transition area.
Indeed. Anyway. Yeah. And and just to close on that, there's one or two good cases from Caesar where we didn't get quite as nice of a transition as this, but there was the kind of basically from rolls to maybe this part type of transition that we captured. And so, yeah, we're really excited to look at that from the aircraft perspective. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great.
Yeah.
All right. If there are no further questions, I don't see anything in the chat, then let's thank everyone once more for Tim's seminar. Thank you for making
Thank you.
time.